core holidays of American culture. Along with Christmas and Halloween, it rounds out the end of the year with a day of feasting, family gatherings, and arguing with your uncle about whether the election was actually stolen by communist Mexicans. Depending on your family's abilities, you might even have some good food. Meanwhile, little kids across the country get to dress up and reenact the first Thanksgiving when the Pilgrims shared a meal with their friends the Indians. This is a story that everyone knows, the story of the Mayflower, of Plymouth Rock, of Squanto, of peaceful cooperation, all culminating in a happy little get together where the Pilgrims kindly shared their food with the local savages. This is also a story that's largely false. This will, in all likelihood, be released after this year's Turkey Day, but I still want to ask you, dear viewer, to just take a moment after the fact and consider the origins of this holiday and the narrative that has been built around it. Plymouth Plantation was founded in the year 1620 by a group known as the Pilgrims, Calvinists who wished to separate from the Church of England. They passed through a deadly first winter with only half of their original members alive, and very little achieved other than a few basic buildings. So much for bringing the glowing light of civilization to savage wilderness. Most of their early survival, even years after their settlement had been established, depended on trade with the Native Americans, particularly the Wampanoag. When they didn't trade, they stole. Disease brought by the settlers had wiped out many villages, and often settlers would just plunder what remained. According to their own estimates, some 90% of the Native American communities around them were wiped out by disease. But what about Squanto? Where was he when everyone was dying? Well, Tisquantum, to use his proper name, was in Europe, first England, and then Spain, where he had been sold into slavery. That's how he learned English, something that doesn't get covered typically. When he escaped and returned to the Americas, he found himself the last surviving member of his tribe. It was his knowledge and teaching them basically how to survive in the region that allowed them to succeed. Which brings us to the first Thanksgiving. Did the Pilgrims invite the Wampanoag? Not exactly. The Pilgrims were celebrating their first harvest in what would become typical American fashion, eating a lot of food and shooting a lot of guns. Alarmed by the commotion and certain an attack was imminent, a band of 90 warriors, Wampanoag warriors, showed up to the colony. I can only imagine what followed was a bit of an awkward moment. The Wampanoag did end up staying for the celebration, and no violence took place, but it's not quite the story that gets told. This is the distinction between myth and reality. The Pilgrims didn't take pity on the savage Indians. If anything, it was the other way around. Historian James Loewen argues that, quote, "The story of the first Thanksgiving is a creation myth, not a piece of history. Like all creation myths, it praises a group of creators, the Pilgrims. It tells the story of how an institution came into existence, American society, and it involves a ritualistic reenactment of the past, eating foods like turkey and cranberries. Basically, may have happened, but its significance has been expanded and shifted far beyond any historical story. When you look at history in a wider sense, centuries of broken promises, violence, dehumanization, slavery, genocide, and cultural extermination, the legend of the first Thanksgiving becomes little more than a blip on the radar. The story we celebrate is not a historical event, but rather an ideal. maybe a glimpse at an imagined timeline, a missed opportunity, perhaps, to have a peaceful relationship with the first inhabitants of the continent, to treat them like human beings rather than mere obstacles to be brushed aside in some divine quest. Happy Thanksgiving.